Welcome one and all to another episode of my RPG podcast. Today's guest is Michael Surbrook. Michael has quite the resume in regards to producing for RPGs. We're talking about stuff that goes back over the past 20 years of various systems and various sorts of genres. So he's actually one of the perfect guests to have on, and I actually got him through Twitter, through a mutual friend. So I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode. Welcome one and all to a new episode of my RPG podcast. Today's guest is Michael Surbrook. Michael, will you please introduce yourself?
Greetings, everyone. I'm Michael Surbrook. I am a game designer. I've been doing various development for different RPGs since the late 90s. Currently, I am Chief Operations Officer for Evil Beagle Games, based out of Denver, Colorado, and just returned from Gen Con, where I helped my roommate launch Wrath and Glory, the new 40K RPG.
Yeah, Michael's got a fantastic resume in regards to RPGs and publishing his own works for RPGs. And we're going to actually get to that in just one moment. But let's start with the genesis, Michael. When did it all begin for you? What was your first foray into RPGs?
My first foray would be around 1977, when my older brother's friends introduced him to a game called Dungeons and Dragons. And then I was introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, and from there it just sort of snowballed. I became really interested. I got the original Little Blue Book, which explained how to adventure from levels 1 to 3, and then picked up modules in the various books. Never really played many campaigns, oddly enough. That never really seemed to happen until late high school and after I got out of high school. So there was a long period of just reading a lot of the books and not having a group to play with, but creating really pointless dungeons. I loved the random dungeon creator in the back of the DMG. But also it opened my eyes to other games. For a while in high school, during lunch, we played a D&D game using the various spell law, arms law, claw law from Rollmaster. I got into Car Wars. We played a bit of Car Wars. I also found you could solo Ogre and GEV, and I fell in love with Steve Jackson games. I do remember eating lunch in art class, because I was allowed during lunch period. I'd eat in art class, and me and somebody I knew, we played Battlesuit, which was the man-to-man combat game of Steve Jackson's Ogre universe. Then I discovered Fantasy Trip, and then messed around with that quite a bit. And I think the big catalyst for my current career is a good friend of mine went to college, and he was introduced to Champions. And then he really wanted to run a Champions campaign. So just as I was toward the end of as I was graduating high school, around 85, he introduced us to Champions. And I really fell in love with the system because you could do anything with it. And after some attempts to create characters that were pretty laughable, I began to get more and more confident with the system, and I subscribed to the Champions mailing list, which is long gone. And people would post character adaptions, and a lot of them they didn't explain why they did what they did, or they didn't explain anything about the character. You were just supposed to know what it is, and I thought I could do better. So I started doing adaptions of a lot of anime and manga characters. I was reading a lot of Battle Angel and Blade of the Immortal, Gunsmith Cats, things like that. And I started writing up characters from fiction, all sources. And I would actually explain why I picked the numbers I did. I saw the character pick this much up, so that equates to this strength. And then when I joined, and I'd post on the hero mailing list, and I'd read people's reactions and adjust them. And then when the hero message boards came around, I did the same there. And in the very late 90s, I saw a copy of Bubblegum Crisis or one of the episodes of Bubblegum Crisis, sitting in a computer Blockbuster, which is completely gone now. By the way, there's one left in like Alaska. But the idea of somebody in powered armor with this enormous cannon, and my interest in Shadowrun and Cyberpunk 2020 and so on led me to create something which ended up getting called Kazei 5, which one of your previous guests has played, Jeff Mueller.
Yes, Jeff Mueller is as you mentioned, one of the previous guests. You guys can listen to that episode in the queue. And what I loved about Jeff, and the reason I got to get to know Michael is because of Jeff, is because Jeff is my elder statesman, and I aspire to be him. But also he's a good person to go to, as well as another previous guest, Dan Wallace, for kind of systems outside of kind of your major RPGs. When you think of like your White Wolves and your vampires and your D&D, Pathfinder, etc., etc. I love him as a resource for that. And what was great is once I started watching, first I started enjoying Michael's tweets. If you guys haven't had the opportunity to, I suggest you subscribe to Michael on Twitter, because he's got a lot of great insights into RPGs and kind of his thoughts, especially when a topic arises, which I'm going to get to actually a little bit later. But I really love the breadth of your resume when it comes to all these games. I mean, you don't just love RPGs, you love and then go far and beyond. You've worked with and created so much work for all these systems. What is it that draws you into RPGs? Is it the mechanics? What is it?
Well, initially what happened was this desire to create. Finishing up how I got into what I do, I was talking to a gentleman named Harry Heckel, who's a designer at Dream Wizards in Maryland, and I described the universe and what I was doing with it. And he said, you should talk to Bruce Harlock. So I did, and Bruce accepted it. And I could sit there and go through all this and kind of bore everybody, but basically that all drew the attention of some major people at Hero, and they gave me the chance to create. And that's really what draws me into it. I actually had a long post about Imposter Syndrome where I talk about why I do what I do. And I realized, having read Stephen King talk about what he does, I will be sitting around, we'll be talking about something, and an idea will come up, and it'll be like, well, I could work with that. I could do this and this and this. And the idea is like, yeah, I can make this into something, and I want to share it with people. Now, I will admit that as I belong to a game company, I look at things with an eye of, will this sell? Will it be worth my energy to do it? Because I have a lot of ideas, and some I know will give me a return. And while I don't live off of my gaming income, it does help in some ways. But there's a twofold thing here. There's the desire to take something and give it to other people and let them play with it, and then feed off their energy to create more. And I will admit, this is a business, and we do run a company. So part of me is also, what will sell? What will people want as well? I don't want to produce material that nobody's interested in. So I want to work it with what people are interested in, but I want to work with what I like to create with what people are interested in, such as what I'm doing for right now. I'm doing a lot of D&D 5e. I really enjoy 5e. It is the D&D game I've been waiting for. I think it's very fun to create for, in my opinion, easy to create for. People enjoy it. It's very popular, and I can get my ideas out and therefore get exposure that somebody may come to me and go, I saw what you did for 5e, but we're doing this thing for this other system, but we think you would be a good fit. And then I can try to expand what I know by working with that. I will admit, my roommate, Ross Watson, said, I think you could do a good job working on some products for Dark Heresy when he was line editor for Dark Heresy. And I said, I don't know, man. I really don't know 40K. And he said, well, we'll work on it. And one of the proudest moments was when the product that we worked on, me and a bunch of others with Ross editing, won a silver Ennie. So I can say I've won an Ennie, even if it was cooperatively. And then one of the people attending, she said, oh, my favorite creature is this. And I was like, well, I created that. And to have somebody who was a huge 40K fan say that what you created is their favorite creature out of the book was, a huge uplift for me. And recently I've been helping, with Wrath and Glory, and got to play some of it. And I'm like, I could work with this. You don't need to be an encyclopedia of 40K. You just need to have an idea of what the setting is like and what works for it. and I can expand my skill set or what I've done by working with this. And in fact, I just went through my roommate and wrote some proposals, and we've sent it in. And I actually made something that he gave me. He said, I want you to create a proposal for this if you feel up to it. I said, I'm going to try it. I said, we went through 3 drafts. The final draft, he said, was perfect. He said it was excellent. We had 2 corrections. We've sent it in, and now I'm going to wait and see. And then I'll learn a little bit more about writing and some project management and elements like that. And if it all goes through, I'm crossing my fingers, I can say, well, I didn't just write that or parts of that. I managed the people who created that, and that's another step forward in what I do. Does that answer your question? I realiast that my stream of consciousness...
No, you're fine. Listen, I love the stream of consciousness, and there's so many things I can pick apart from just that stream. But let me reel it back to that very beginning when you're talking about it, imposter syndrome and kind of getting your start into this kind of field or any field in general. I think the most difficult thing for any sort of journey or whatever is the first step, right? Is that feeling of like, I can actually do this thing, not just maybe casually, but maybe I can produce a product that people will want to enjoy and get into. What is it then was that first step? I think you might have mentioned it a little bit earlier when seeing somebody look at your stuff and thinking like, hey, this is actually really, really good. Let's get you involved there. But do you think I just want to know, what was your kind of map to get here? Was it just creating something and then having the right people get to it? Or did you make a defined, I'm going to go pursue creating content for RPGs or a specific system?
I was originally creating for a specific system. I was originally creating for Hero System, which you made some people I named, but no better as champions. I created one item which was actually very popular. The original version of Kazei 5 was by many said to be, if you want to do Cyberpunk and Champions, you get this supplement. And I continued to do what I like to do, which was I would see something in a TV show or movie or in an anime or read something in a book or a comic or whatever. And I would create it. And this let me, first of all, I tried to make my writing better. I wanted the character sheets to be cleaner. I wanted my explanations to be better. I wanted to improve how I was communicating information so that people would not come back and go, I don't understand what you did. And I remember one of my proudest moments is when I spent a week or more reading the entire Del Rey run of Conan, all 3 books. I took extensive notes. I wrote them up. If you know Champions 5th edition, he was a 500-point barbarian warrior, which meant he was more points than your starting superheroes. And I posted them, and somebody said, I can't complain. You've explained why you picked what you did. You explained the numbers. You explained, everything that he's done. And you even point out where you can add more abilities to him that you didn't do. And you've made it so that I understand why you have written what you have written. And it was work like that made one of the people when Hero Games was purchased in the early aughts, said, there's people I'd like to have work for us and do work for us. And my name was on the list. And the next stepping stone then was being asked to work on a book called Ninja Hero, which, like many creators, I look back and shake my head because I'm like, it could be so much better. But from there, I communicated and was able to work with the people at Hero. And that work drew attention to, like I said, my friend Ross Watson, who was a big friend of Kazei 5. And then from there, it sort of snowballed. Some people recommended, said, well, he does good work. You might ask him to do this. And then when the chance came to do third-party work for Hero games, as in Hero System compatible but not published by Hero, I had an outlet for a lot of creative ideas from there. And then it just sort of worked its way along. As I sent you the resume, you can see I'm almost up to probably a broken 50 published products that I've either written for, in some cases, have some illustrations in, or now I'm also doing mapping.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually put this in the description of the podcast if you guys want to see the full list of Michael's work. But it sounds for me like you had kind of a structured idea of what you wanted to do initially, and you made it as best and as good as possible. And that works kind of spoke for itself, and from there came kind of a reputation of you being able to do that, and then the right people getting into contact with you. So I think that's one of the lessons to understand from anything in life is maybe a disciplined approach, having a definable goal about what you want to accomplish. And maybe it doesn't have to be so large as like, let's say I want to feed, my wife and kids off of, my RPGs or my publishing or my art or my music or whatever profession you're in, but you have an interest, you like a thing, and you decide like, I want to make content for that thing, and you try to make it as best as possible. And I also, not going to bring up your LinkedIn or anything here, but I think probably part of the reason you were so good at explaining why your system and your creation worked so well is because you do tend to, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think you have kind of an analytical technical background, just considering what you do as a regular day job, right?
Yeah. Well, the curious thing is that my current job comes from my RPG writing. I had been a Macintosh support tech for a very long time and wanted to get out of that. I thought about getting into web development, discovered that my creative mind does not extend to programming. And that really cuts short your web design career right there. I do not grok Java and PHP and some of these other things. I understand bits of it, but parts of it just get away from me. However, the man who hired me for the job that I have now saw a book that I had done, which was the second edition of Kazei 5 that clocked in at over 200,000 words and 320 pages. And he later told me his thought was, anybody who can write that can write my documentation. So I parlayed that in my current job, which has then expanded into a couple other things. But curiously, one of the side jobs that I also hold, somebody said to one of the people on the project, do you know anybody who can write? They said, yeah, actually we do. So now I find myself doing blogs and what's called SEO, search engine optimization and such. And I edited a thesis to clean it up, to make it legible. And there are people in the Denver area, because I fear I may have to look for a new job because the contract I'm on may end soon. And they're like, yeah, you write clearly, you write in an informative manner. You do research well. We could use you. So I would say it's kind of like the snake that eats itself, or the infinity symbol. One feeds the other and improves both sides. The more I work doing cleaning up reports and everything, the more I understand how I want to clean up what I write. But the more I write for games, the better I feel confident about writing in general, and it just goes back and forth. I would say anybody who wants to get into gaming actually has an easier barrier now, because you have Drive-Thru-RPG, you have DM's Guild, you have various other outlets, some of whom will let you use trade dress from the game that you want to do. If you go through DM's Guild, you can use a lot of D&D artwork and images and so on to enhance your product. And that's a great outlet. Now, granted, a lot of people do it. You may be lost in the vast sea. But if you want to make your product stand out, you really need to define what your product's going to be about. If you're going to write up a class, make sure that it's you clearly are defining what the class do. You play test it a bit, make sure it's clear. If it's a monster, make sure the numbers all work. Make sure that you've got a pretty accurate challenge rating. Make sure that you are explaining what it is. If you're doing something for another game system, the same holds true. You can't proofread your own stuff, so try to have somebody else do it. Dump it into Word, dump it into Google Docs, have them look for the gross errors, read your sentences out loud, read them backwards, because that's a good way to find when you've written reading them out loud, you go, wow, it sounds really awkward. Think about what you're doing. And that's really the most important thing. And read what other people do. There's some people I know who don't like to read, but they want to create, and it's like, well, you can do that, but if you don't want to be tone deaf, and Neil Gaiman and I think Stephen King will both say this, and this holds true for if you're going to do fiction, if you're going to do gaming, read what other people are doing, see how they get their ideas across, and try to either take what you like or mentally highlight what you think is done badly, and don't make either do what they do or try to adapt what they do to what you want to do, or don't make those mistakes. And that's really, I think, will help you get ahead and get people's attention to yourself and your product.
Absolutely, and I think you've had so many great points in there that anybody can take from and definitely use as good advice. Now, more personally to the way you game, what do you look for in a system or an adventure or something like that will tell you like, oh, this is good, this is fun, this is crafted well? Is it technical? Is it a feeling? I know we mentioned earlier about like if there's like a show, like an anime or manga thing inspired or some thought that you have that's kind of a trigger that you can latch onto. But is it the same way when you look at systems? Do you look for a certain sort of trigger or a mechanism to latch onto?
Yeah, one thing I really like or look forward to would be a certain flexibility. I was a huge fan of the hero system because it could let you do just about anything, and that let you that had immense flexibility with regards to what kind of games you could run, what kind of characters you can play, what genres you could be in, and some people will say it's a very complex system. It's math intensive, and I will admit it is not your typical starting RPG. D&D, especially 5e, is the perfect gateway. If you like that, well, let's go on to something a little bit more elaborate. I'm willing to try, many games. There was a time period where I had a Thursday night group where we played just about anything, and we experimented with Weapons of the Gods. We experimented with Thousand Suns and with Tristat and all this. And there were times I'd grow frustrated because the game seemed very artificially limited. There's other times it's like, I really like what this does because it's easy to understand and it's flexible and does not constrain you. Now, granted, one of the most flexible systems out there I don't get, which is Fate, and I just admit I'm not a fan of Fate. Adventure-wise, I like to look for something that understands that that the GM needs to be flexible. I still think Curse of Strahd is the best 5e game module put out so far, simply because it does not dictate a path. It is wide open for what the players can do. And when I sat down for my session 0 in Maryland, and when I sit down for my session 0 here in Denver, I will say, you can wander into places that are way out of your pay grade. You may have to consider retreating and coming back. There's no guarantee that everything is going to be leveled to you because the way the place is set up. There is no railroad. There's no you go from here to here to here. It is very much a sandbox. And I played in up to 16th level before I moved out here, Tyranny of Dragons, and the GM for that groused that it was at times railroady and sketchy, and did not help the GM with all the options that may be needed, or sort of presumed that players were going to go from A to B to C to D. And in fact, there was one point where I was looking over and helping proof an adventure for Wrath and Glory, and I went to Ross, and he didn't write this, so somebody else did, and I said, the problem with the way this is structured is that the writer assumes the players are going to do this action, when I can think of 4 or 5 other actions that could occur at this point, and he doesn't address that. And that's kind of a big mistake. You need to acknowledge that more than what you see as the solution is going to occur. And so if I'm going to play, my decision if I'm going to play a published module is, after I read through it, do I feel it gives me enough information that I can run with it? Is it just on a rail? One of the complaints I've heard about the old Dragonlance modules is that because they were taken from the novels, they had a pretty narrow focus, and you ran, as they put it, they railroaded you through to get to the end point. And now, granted, it's hard to do a full sandbox for every module you write, but I think a certain degree of flexibility is really, really needed, which is why I never bought any Champions modules back in the day, because they often presumed too much. And I'm like, they don't fit in my superhero universe. And then after a while, I wasn't running superheroes, and I didn't need them. If I got them for like $1, I'd pick them up because I'd always like to see the builds that people did for villains. But I'm also a real big fan of, with Champions, I was a real big fan of anything that was a guide to equipment or creatures or spells or powers. And with 5e, I'm all about Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, Santher's Guide to Everything, Volos, and so on, because they show me all the options and give me a bigger box to play in. Does that help?
No, that actually, that's great, because that's one of the things, ironically enough. Well, I didn't have the opportunity to go to Gen Con because unfortunately it's kind of sandwiched right between two of the major cons I go to, which are Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, and Dragon Con. I did have the opportunity to get a friend of mine into DMing for the very, very first time. And he was kind of spur of the moment thing. We need to help somebody out. And we needed a whole bunch of DMs as fast as possible. So I had the difficulty of being like, I need to turn somebody who's, only been a player and has never had a GM mentality into a GM in about a night. But what was great is I happen to have had run a game from it's from Winghorn Press. It's a one shot called the Wild Sheep Chase or Wild Sheeple Chase or something like that. But what I really loved about this adventure was that it was very, very open, and not in the sense of like, oh, you don't have any direction as a DM how to run it. It's very obvious, like if X then Y can happen, but literally in the text itself, it goes, here's the idea of what this person's like. Here's what their motivations are like generally. So if anything strays from this, always push towards this general direction. And if the party even just ignores him or kills him when he's not, before the next step, fine. You can just run with something else. It literally tells you, like, here's just a general idea and play from there. And I thought that was one of the best options to give to my friend, and it worked great because it gave him the freedom to make it an adventure of his own and never feel like he's failing or like, oh no, I should consult the text and see what comes next. And then I talked to him immediately after, and he tells me how the adventure run, and I was like, dude, I've run that adventure 4 or 5 times and I've never had it go that way. That's brilliant. It's kind of what I want ultimately in published content, is the idea that we're not all running the same thing, even though we can hit the same points. And I actually love Curse of Strahd. I'm not going to create any spoilers here, especially if my players listen. But, done a year and a half in Barovia and not even touched a large part of that content because it's so open, and I can kind of they can go left and right and then kind of retreat after they run into a place that's out of their level until they can come back and maybe resolve that, dispute or resolve that adventure or that monster battle. And that, I think I agree with you in a great deal. It's kind of one of my favorite things about kind of more flexible RPG systems. Now, I've had only a small bit of time with Fate, so I don't know if I don't like it like you do, but I've loved Open Legend, which is a system that I've had the opportunity to even guest on a stream for. I enjoy Open Legends for that as well as a GM, because I'm more than likely going to Rule of Cool if I think the rule is too stringent or I can't open up this moment.
Well, so actually, quick side note. I listened to the interview or when you had Jeff on the show, and I will brag. I was the GM that killed it for that Curse of Strahd game. You probably figured that out.
Yeah.
But so 2 things. I actually have a couple of convention adventures that I run, and I will state, while a one-shot, which may take 4 to 6 hours, depending on how long you like to play, can be open-ended, I will say if you're going to create a convention adventure, they often have to be very limited in scope. You have 6 people who don't know each other. You've got a limited amount of time. If they don't know the game, you've got to get them into it quickly. And the story can, maybe some people can do an elaborate story, but I tend to do very narrow focus, very simple, direct to the point stories. On the other hand, often the players, they really just want to be entertained. They want to roll dice, have fun. They're not, you're not going to get the deep, immersive, and I'm not being sarcastic, role-playing experience, because most of the time, these are pre-generated characters, and they're just coming in to have a good time, maybe try out a system, try out, play with somebody they know.
It's RPG fast food is the way I think of it.
Now,
like, you don't go to a fast food restaurant for a 3-course meal and to feel like you're at home.
Right. Now, on the other hand, one of the things one of my scenarios is Matt Mercer's To the Poop, converted from Pathfinder to 4E or 5E. And I will admit that while the base sequence of events is the same every time, some of the things they do at the beginning and some of the stuff that happens at the end, it's never the same thing twice. And there's a couple of scenarios. There's one I've run that's very much a railroad, because you go down a sewer in one direction, and people get so wrapped up in how weird everything is and the strange things that are going on, and the payoff is what happens at the end, where each player has to make their own decision. And I've noted, I said, this is what we've been playing 3 hours for, is now you guys get to argue among themselves. And I've noted that I'm always amazed at what happens. Now that said, when you are running a module, and I ran Curse of Strahd for 15 months only because I was moving out here, and we did cut it short a little bit soon because there were some places they wanted to go. Then I said, we're just going to have to get cut to the chase because I only got like 3 or 4 sessions left before we have to go. And everybody knew that, getting into Ravenloft was going to eat a chunk of time. But even when you're running something that's published, I think there is that, let's go with that attitude, which is, if you have like a GM, I had an idea about how I wanted to switch things around. I'm going to do that. I'm going to take out something I don't like and put in something that works better. Or if I get a feel for how the players are, I may add in elements. And two of the people in my Curse of Strahd game, one had run it for me and the other guy that was also in the Curse of Strahd game. And I know at times they were like, oh, that's not even, they were like, that's not in the book. Mike's going completely original. And they didn't care. In fact, there was a few points where I know one of them was grinning under his scarf that he would pull up over his face to hide smiles and smirks and things because he was like, oh yeah, I like where all this is going. So I think even if you're running a published module, don't be afraid to put your own stamp on it. If you see something you don't like or you have an idea, and as I said, the phrase I have is, if the player says something, oh yeah, let's go with that. Ken Hite brings this one up, and I've seen other people talk about it too. If the players get really convinced that X is the answer and the book says Y, maybe make it X anyways, because they feel brilliant. We figured it out. And you're like, yeah, whatever. It doesn't matter if it's X or Y. Did they achieve what they wanted to achieve and having fun?
And I think this goes back to a thing I wanted to talk about, mechanics as well, because I think I forget it was Mike Merles or Chris Perkins who was bringing this up recently about maybe changing the way failures and successes are done on ability checks in Dungeons and Dragons, because there's a lot of this, like, you roll, you don't hit the DC, you do hit the DC, and maybe aside from like a critical pass or a critical fail, it just becomes a fail and no fail condition, which is not really that great from a role playing standpoint. So one of the things I say also as to anyone who's jamming and DMing all the time is you want the players to feel like every action, failure or success, does create some sort of impact on the world or the game or the adventure. So just the thing I always hated as a GM, and I tried to change my games, is the idea of like, oh well, we're just gonna have to roll until somebody finally hits a fucking 15 and we get over this wall or get through this like maze or whatever what we're doing. That's when I think you lose the immersion and it just becomes like a tedious task. So if you ever have to roll too much, I think as a GM, it's kind of your job to introduce something to make these like failures feel like they affected the world. Maybe you drop some bats or some large creature on them because you were making such a racket or something like that.
Yeah, well, actually, let me expand upon what you just said. Because I have a couple of things that I can drop out that I love. First of all, Ross addresses this in Wrath and Glory. He has something called failing forward, which is you can fail to meet the difficulty check. The DN, I think, the difficulty number. But the GM lets you succeed, but then throws a complication. And in D&D, because that's the easiest one, the idea being, well, it's a DC 15 to pick this lock, and you roll a 14. And the GM can go, you know what? You did pick the lock. But, and that's, of course, the worst thing you want to hear. And he says, you broke your tools. That's one thing. Or, hey, the guards down the corner has heard something, or the wandering monster, the orc troop or the owlbear has wandered up the hallway. So sure, you didn't technically pick the lock, but you did. But now you have a further complication. You have to get through the door before whatever it is shows up. Or now your picks are damaged and it may be harder to pick the next lock. You have to see about replacing them, that kind of an element. And in Curse of Strahd, and what I like to do when I run convention games is if you roll a 1, now a 1 in a skill check is not always a failure. It's only a natural 1 on a 2 hit, because a 1 on a skill check could be like it's a DC 10 difficulty check. You've got a 1, but you've got plus 11. Oh, you've got an 11 anyway, so you made it, which shows how skilled and heroic you are. But what I will do is I'll say, well, how'd you fail? And I've had people like, hey, what? I'm asking you, how did you fail? What did you do that resulted in the fail? And it being like, oh, I threw my weapon away. It broke. It got stuck. I fell down. And players actually really like that idea that I'm asking them and this happened in the Wrath and Glory demos I did, where it's like, well, you got a failure, you got a conflict, not a failure, you got a complication on your attack. So you hit your enemy, but something else happened. One guy's like, well, can I run my sword through him so hard I ram it into a pipe behind him? I said, yes, that is perfect, and I'm going to give you the equivalent of inspiration for that because that's awesome. And I said, if I knew all the rules inside and out, I would have now put a complication into the battlefield that your guys' ranged attacks are harder because there's mist blowing out of the pipe. And the same can be said for when you're like if you're doing D&D, and in some cases it could be I use an inspiration pool where I have a bowl or platter in front of me and I just throw poker chips into it. So an individual player doesn't get inspiration, the entire party does. And there's been times where it's like, okay, well, you did this, but you're going to succeed. I'm going to throw a chip in there. And there's one time where somebody was waffling, and I held a chip over the bowl and said, do the dumb thing, which is more exciting. I drop a chip, play it safe. You don't get the chip. I don't remember what he did, honestly. I think he
actually
safe.
I love that do the dumb thing. And yeah, I mean, ultimately this game, well, not just this game. I think RPGs in general are an escape and also a power fantasy. We want to feel like we're doing something to the world. We're having an effect on it. So I love how you kind of took, which, Matt Mercer's kind of made very popular and famous now, the whole how you want to do this on a success, and inverted that and been like, how are you going to fail this? I think that's great. And that's kind of tying back to like what our role as a GM is to do. We're the enablers of fun. We're the enablers of fun.
It's also the idea of player agency. You're giving the player more say in what's going on. So he's not just he or she, they are not a spectator. They have an active voice in, this is why you have a session 0 too, in maybe what the campaign's about or what they're bringing into the campaign and what happens. Now, at the same time, there were points where you're right, you shouldn't have to roll. One of the great examples just is the game Gumshoe, in which if you miss the clue, they move it. You're always going to find this clue. And they point out nobody ever misses a clue in a clue-intensive TV show. It's what they do with the clues they find that's important. So I'm running the game, and I may draw ire, but some people agree with me. I think Mercer asks for too many die rolls. There are many times where I'd be like, no, you should just say you do it, especially if it's something you're supposed to be really good at. And
I think that's a stall tactic, honestly. Because I'm also a critical fan like you. I've watched him a long enough time to see, like, usually they'll ask him maybe a lore thing or a quick question. He goes, yeah, just roll. And then I think he's stalling to give himself that moment, because a lot of respect to him if that's what he's doing, because I do it sometimes myself.
Right. But I do think there's times where it's like, make a performance check, do this. And I'm like, man, you should just let him do it. And get, because they often fail and sometimes it's really bad. And you're like, but I thought that's what they were good at. This is also a style. Somebody may say, no, that's his style. And I'm like, that's true. But I also like what another GM did by the name of Darren Watts. And he was running a pulp era game. And this being the pulps, a mad scientist was activating an earthquake machine in Central Park. And Lord Greystoke, who you would know as Tarzan, the player says, well, I want to get to Central Park. And it was like, well, how do you do it? Well, I'm going to go out in the fire escape, run down the fire escape, leap off that, land on a power line and start running along the power lines, and making my way there. And another player looked over, and the GM said, you do it. Another player looked over and said, doesn't he make like an agility check for that? And the GM looks at that player and says, dude, he's fucking Tarzan. And to me, I've often felt I try to keep in my mind what's called the Tarzan rule. And it does not come up when you're in the middle of a fight, because that is why you're rolling dice. We cannot predict the fight. But let's say we go a critical roll. Grog walks into an orc camp, and he wants to impress on this big orc warlord how tough and strong he is. So he picks up the spit that they are using to grill over the fire, and he wants to bend it into a knot. Mercer would probably say make a strength check. I'd be like, if he fails it, he looks like a fool. However, Mercer may go, well, if you fail it, he can add to the plot. But I'm like, you know what? Grog's whole bit is he's now got a 20-some-odd strength. He's big. He's 8 feet tall. His whole thing is he's incredibly strong. Yeah, you bend it like it's a wet noodle. Now you have maybe now at that point, yeah, you've impressed them, but one of them may decide he's going to have to show you up. So I've added to the plot, but we've also shown a character doing what their shtick is. And you have to be careful, though. You want to make sure it's when failure makes you look like a fool. Don't have them fail. Let them. They're the protagonists. They're the main characters of the story. You are watching or playing. You're watching this anime. You're watching this movie. You're reading this book because you want to know what this character is going to do, and you want to see them. There obviously there are times where they're going to fail, but they are the reason why you're here. So you don't want to make them look foolish over something little.
And that could ruin their entire experience in RPGs in general. I mean, I've met so many people who were scared of getting into RPGs. I was like, why? And it goes, oh, I tried one time and I like rolled bad, or I didn't get it and I didn't play really well and people were down on me. And I'm like, well, shit, that's kind of on, like, yeah, there's the chance that you roll 7 natural ones in one session, or, 7 failures in one session, and nobody wants to suck. So you're right. Like there's kind of a need also for the GM, because going back to what we're talking about, running one shots at conventions, you also want everybody to have a moment, because you're right. This is 7 random humans who are just wanting to sit down and play. They each want to take something from this session. So if unfortunately one guy or gal is rolling like shit the entire time, and they're supposed to be so good at this thing, but they can't roll real well, throw them a freaking bone, like, well, I can say I've had this happen to me both ways, where I've failed and I've caught it sometimes, where I notice somebody's not having a moment or is kind of out of it, is maybe turning the story towards them and allowing them to have a moment to shine. Right.
And actually some things I've done too was with the inspiration bowl, everybody can draw on it, and there may be more chips than there are players. And I may say, well, give me a chip or give me an inspiration point and you can do X. And that can turn the situation around. The other thing is when you ask them, it brings them into the story. I hate the meme about you roll a 1 and you fall on your sword, or you caress the orc on the back, and because I'm like that is a style of play I don't like. So if the person just can't get the dice to work, you might actually say try some different dice. You go, hey, there's the pile of inspiration, roll again, or give me a few, tell me what you want to do, and I'll tell you, give me a few chips and you do it. And it gets them back into the story. And I actually did this because we had a character in a game I was running where everybody thought the character was kind of spacey and airheaded. And they were, but they were also supposed to be this like idiot savant gunfighter. And at one point the player said, I want Claire to shoot the knife out of the Lich's hand. And I went, okay. And I looked at the character sheet and I said, everybody thinks this, in the back of my head, everybody thinks the knife is the Lich's focus. And it's not. It's really just a knife. So I said, you know what? This is your Tarzan moment. You do it. You shoot it out. It shatters. Crazy shot. And everybody's like, wait, what? Claire just shot a knife out, hip shot out of a hand? Yep, because it showed what the character could do and was capable of. And it didn't affect the outcome of the fight, because it had no effect on the Lich's ability to use its enchantments. So it worked out for both of us. And that is, I think, important, which is bringing the players in and making sure that they feel like they're contributing, even if it is asking them how they didn't work. Or you could try the whole, hey, I'm going to take an inspiration chip out of the pool, and sure, you didn't make the DC, but now you did. But now I'm going to throw an additional complication to notch up what I call the Chris Perkins tension meter, which is, by the way, I've noticed that whenever he gets asked a question in Dice Camera Action, he does it more in DCA than in Acquisition Incorporated games, but he does it there too. When he has a choice, when people aren't certain, and it's like, or when he has to introduce a new element, he doesn't introduce the worst element, but he often introduces an element which raises the overall tension of the situation and makes things more urgent. And I like that idea. Anybody who goes off the map where the players can't see him is in Schrodinger's territory. I know where they are in the Curse of Strahd game, where I really used this, and I knew where they were if somebody went looking for them. But I knew that the moment somebody returned, they were just going to show up no matter where they were, because they were nebulous. And I wanted to be like, yeah, you walk off alone, then this guy who you thought ran away is going to be there. And now let's see what happens. And it worked.
Yeah, and I will say, I'm going to tie this back now to all the things we've been talking about.
Sorry,
we keep referencing.
I can
no, dude.
go off on tangents.
That's totally fine, and I love that, and that's why I do a podcast. Literally, the reason I do a podcast is because I found out when I have these conversations at conventions, when I have these conversations at geeky cafes or bars and things like that, they become these hour, 2, 3 hour long things that I keep talking about over and over and over again. And then I end up like having to talk, multiple times just because I haven't gotten everything out. So this is why I have this podcast. Don't sweat it. So the reason I kind of wanted to go back to a little thing is because you kind of touched on it earlier when you mentioned Gen Con and stuff like that. And we keep bringing up all these sorts of like D&D streams or RPG streams and things like that. Is like we are in, I'm going to say it, RPG tabletop renaissance right now. And we are never going to, I don't think ever anymore due to technology, never going to be at a shortage of content in regards to tips and production and publications and things like that. So for somebody like you who started before this all began and at a time where maybe RPGs weren't as popular, to have then done it the hard way and now see how readily accessible all this content is and how easy it is with, as you mentioned, Drive-Thru RPG, DM's Guild and stuff like that. What are your kind of thoughts? I mean, are you like, how are you feeling having kind of lived in both these eras?
Well, I still like going to a physical game store. And if you live in Maryland, I highly recommend you go to Games and Stuff in Glen Burnie. But the reason is that it's nice to be able to look at something. That's why I like going to Gen Con. I spent one Gen Con, I ended up spending the entire time in the dealer's room. I just wandered from booth to booth and looked at things and talked to people and played demos and so on. And there is a nice hands-on feature to that. On the flip side, it's also nice to that the barrier for entry is much lower. Now, I do think we do a very good job laying out and producing our products, but I like the fact that we can just push it up to Drive-Thru RPG. I can send a link out on social media, and hopefully people will look at it and pick up a copy. So it is, it used to be a big deal to go to the game store. And it actually can still be a big deal to go to a game store, but I think it's the best of both worlds. You have the physical product that shows up at the conventions and the dealer's hall and so on, and in the game stores, but you also have an enormous amount of electronic product that you can pick up and then drop onto your tablet, onto your iPad or your phone, and so make it easier there. You don't have to carry as many books around. People can produce product on very obscure subjects. I will admit the stuff that I'm producing for Evil Beagle for 5e, which, I can go over with you in a bit. Some of it, somebody goes, that's kind of obscure. I'm like, yeah, but people like it and it's fun to create, and which is what I like about it. So, and it's also now with Skype and Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds and what was the other one?
Fantasy Grounds, D&D Beyond, Roll20.
Discord.
Discord,
yeah,
yes.
You can. You can play online. I've never actually played online yet. Much, I don't think. In that fashion. But that's how Dice Camera Action works. Chris is in Seattle, and the other people are all over the United States. We all can't. We all don't get to have Felicia Day as a friend with a full studio to be able to do this. Ross has been asked to stream Wrath and Glory games out of our basement, so we'll have a studio in our basement. Flip side is that I get a really, really nice gaming table out of this that we can use when we're not streaming. So my Curse of Strahd game will have a really nice table to be played on. And the other thing is that production quality has gone up. I can tell you that in 1977, it was you had the nice hardback D&D books, but you had a lot of mimeographed, stapled, done on a typewriter, very basically laid out books with, you go back and you look at early Judges Guild and Travelers Aid Society, Judges Guild products and other products, editing, layout, tables, paste up, art, it's all very, very crude. If you actually look and try to read the first 3 D&D books, you're going to look at me and go, how did this become so popular? It's incomprehensible in places, but it did. It really struck a nerve, and it just exploded. And it's great. Gary Gygax literally went from living in his mother's basement, selling insurance, and I think repairing shoes, if I hear it correctly, to being a multimillionaire when that really, really meant something in the space of 4 years. And these days, unfortunately, those fortunes are not going to happen. I mean, if somebody comes to me and goes, well, you're in the gaming industry, how do I make it big in the gaming industry? I'm going to be like, develop a really good miniatures game, which runs the risk of either big bucks or big loss. Develop some really good board game, or a really good CCG. RPGs are not the way to go, but I prefer RPGs because I feel there's more creativity, more content I can create, and I like the social activity because it's not a win-loss as most games are unless they're cooperative. And it is a big cooperative social gathering, and we play it for 4 to 6 hours at a time.
And I will admit, I think, and you can correct me if I'm maybe going too far off and putting words in your mouth there, but I don't think you go into these types of things you do want to, expecting to become a multimillionaire and become, a mogul and things like that. I think because of the natural creative bent to all the stuff we do, I think the process, the journey in and of itself is a large part of satisfaction. And then the fact that we can then possibly get some lunch or dinner or maybe pay a mortgage off of it is a great bonus.
Well, for a while there, if it paid for my ability to Gen Con, I felt I was doing fine. And the joke is also, how do you make a small fortune in the gaming industry? You start with a large fortune.
I like that one.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, though, success can also be measured by, are we doing reasonably well? Can I support myself? I think Evil Beagle is very small. We have some well-known products and some well-known developers. We would love to be the next Green Ronin. I'll be very honest. I'd love to be of that level of business and such, but I also understand it's a highly competitive market. There are dozens and dozens of RPGs out there, and the big ones will come and go. FASA is not what it used to be. Iron Clown is not what it used to be. Chaosium almost went bankrupt. Steve Jackson has reported not losses, but they reported that our profits has been dropping for the past few years, and it's due to a lot of reasons. First of all, nobody's going to be the first of anything much anymore. There was, somebody had to be the first fantasy game, somebody had to be the first cyberpunk game, somebody had to be the first superhero game. A lot of those niches are already taken up. So nowadays, you can create a new RPG, you can create a new popular RPG. Pathfinder is about 10 years old, and it's a D&D spinoff, but it's very popular. The Star Wars and Genesis are, if I saw correctly, are in the top 5 sales of the recent month. So you can create something that's new and have it explode. Shadowrun came out of nowhere, really. It was like, well, and the time was right for a good cyberpunk game. Where's Cyberpunk 2020? But I think it hit that, once again, it was one of those perfect storms. The rules weren't the best. People will readily admit that. But the art direction, the layout, the writing, it just caught people by storm. And you can always do that. You should not be one should not look at what they're producing with I don't know if this is going to sell. I'm not going to do it. You can never guarantee. Get your stuff out there and let the market decide. And if you really, really want to be a full-time game developer, then you need to be able to produce content on demand in large amounts and work as much as possible. And maybe you'll be one of the lucky ones. I only know of a few people off the top of my head that I can guarantee are full-time game developers, and many of them are not making large amounts of money. I make more than my roommate doing what I do, but I think sometimes, and he doesn't have more fun than me either. I know that the deadlines of getting things ready and trying to deal with licenses and so on, it can be a very stressful situation. And it could be worse if you go into video game development, which is where the really big money is. But it's a lot harder to crack into that. And you need often a much bigger team. One person can create a pretty decent gaming supplement, but one person is not going to create a video game all by themselves. You need a team. So you've got to weigh what you want to do and how you want to do it and what returns you want. Everybody wants to be successful. Everybody wants to be able to, sit back and just, all I'm doing is going to create games and watch the money roll in. But, you also have to understand that's not something that's going to happen to everybody. But on the other hand, don't let that stop you. If you have a passion for creating, for a long time, I would come home from work and I would play something for about an hour, and then I would set that aside and I'd break out my notes and I'd get to work on whatever concept I was writing up. And then eventually, I would get it to whoever was willing to publish it. And Kickstarter has been a huge benefit for that. And we would get it out there, and I'd eventually get a bit of a check, and I'd feel pretty good about it.
And I mean, right now you're even making content for, which is the kind of prevalent RPG of the Twitch and streaming world. It's D&D 5e right now. Like you mentioned, it's kind of the greatest kind of intro to RPGs you can kind of pick because of how it's kind of simplified, refined, and open it is. And you're creating content for that now. So what's the content looking like?
So it all goes back to the Curse of Strahd game. You're running it, so you know that there is the tables of what you can encounter when you're on the road. And I had ideas for additional encounters. And this coalesced, and I thought about it. And I'm now using the term cogitate a lot because of being around 40K at the moment. But what happened was that I thought about, I'm going to do 100 random encounters. And then sanity took over and I cut it to 50. But what happened was that I said, well, I called it Unpleasant Discoveries. And I said, it's going to be a collection of things for your players to encounter in Gothic horror themed games. And I realized that it was basically saying this is for Curse of Strahd, but I also, in the introduction, I talked about what is horror, how to run horror. I took lessons I had learned from Ken Hite and Robin Laws and Ross Watson and others, and I included it. My friend Bill Keys goes, well, here's this little article or this small essay I wrote on how to run horror, and I put it all in there. And I stressed this is what you can use it for. And I said, this is obviously for Curse of Strahd, but you could use it for a Draco Lich's region. You could use it for a Mummy Lich, for hags, for vampire lords, demons. Just modify it a bit. And then I started writing encounters, and it was anything from, you find stuff in the road to one of my favorites is you find an entire ruined farmstead. And there are 2d6 skeletons that are going through the motions of farming. And if you don't disturb them, you could walk right through the farmstead. But if you don't disturb them, don't attack them, don't cast spells on them, don't try to turn them, they completely ignore you. But of course, if you interfere with them, they are going to try to fight you off and then go back to whatever they were doing. And some of them were very elaborate, and some of them were very basic. And when I was done, I was like, that was pretty good. And so I did Feywild discoveries, and it set up the pattern. The first quarter to third of the article is going to be me talking about the subject matter, the Feywild and fairies and what they are like according to European legend, and what is meant by to be capricious, and what the Seelie and Seelie court is like, and then 50 encounters. And I did one for the Underdark where I went into let me define for you cave formations and what they're like, and how caves are made, and how you can treat this in the Underdark. And by the way, what are real world cave creatures like? Oh, hey, they should all be white. They should all have ridiculously long antennae. They should all have either tremor sense or blind sense. And by the way, here at the end of this all, and this started actually with Feywild discoveries, here's some custom stat blocks. Here is some creatures adapted loosely from Brian Ford's Book of Fairies and my other fairy source books that I have. Here's some blind cave creatures and so on. And then I did one called City Discoveries, where I did 50 street level, 50 sewer encounters, and I talked about how to build a city and elements of it. And I just finished the biggest one at 28,000 words, which is Draconic Discoveries, and is supposed to being 50 random encounters of dragons, because I realized that wasn't going to work. It is a lair, written up lair with maps. There's about 14 maps, one for each dragon type. So there's a gold dragon lair, there's a red dragon lair, and so on. But also for dragon creatures, like there's a Hydra lair, there's a Behir lair, there's a Wyvern lair, and so on. And hey, you get two custom stat blocks. I have a Kiolung, which is your classic Chinese dragon, and I have a Lindorm, which is your Scandinavian worm snake dragon. And I did that. And actually, when you first contacted me, I was going to reread the introduction I had written for something called Treasure Discoveries, which will be not 50 random treasures, because that'd be kind of boring, it's going to be a whole breakdown of precious metals, gems, gem cuts, a whole glossary, because you find a coffer. What is a coffer? What is treasure kept in? And then I'm going to try to look for folklore and jewels. What is it used for? What rare woods, definition of metals. And then I have waiting in the wings because the ideas keep coming, and this is where this whole Stephen King. There's a floodgate in my head. I want to do one for Oceanic. I want to do one called Fiendish Discoveries. I want to do one called Astral Discoveries for the astral plane. And then my roommate Ross said, "What about giants?" And I was like, "Well, I could do that just like Draconic, an encounter that the GM can modify and add on to for each giant type. And an Etten, a storm giant, ogre, oni, all that. Be about 14 of those. And I might even try to do some custom giants. In fact, I did. I actually wrote up a stonecoat, which is a giant of Native American mythology. And then I don't know when it'll come out, but hopefully I'll be able to work on these from now to the end of the year. And I actually approached Evil Beagle and said, well, maybe we could Kickstarter and do a printed version called Fantastic Discoveries, where all of this is in one book. And Sean Fannin, my boss and owner, the major owner of the company, was like, that's a great idea. We just have to cover development's all done. We just cover printing and art, and we can get it out and distribute it through Studio 2, and we can get it into game stores. And even then, we're like, yeah, if we go overboard, we could have stretch goals like 25 mountain discoveries, 25 swamp discoveries. And it just keeps coming. And this is kind of, this is the creative energy where I've got to get an outlet of it. I've got a notebook here that I can't show you because I don't have the camera going, that is absolutely crammed with notes, and a lot of which is crossed out because I've already used it, but I'm constantly adding to it. And I'm like, this is a good game idea. And somebody might say, well, it's kind of obscure. And I'm like, yeah, but some people have been like, these are really useful because it's a plot seed, it's an adventure hook, if I just desperately need something on the fly. And toward the end of my Curse of Strahd game, I actually started using my own list of discoveries, and everybody was like, those are pretty neat. And I was pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all strive for. I mean, not just as RPG fans, I think as any sort of creative person, is you strive for that thing that will just make you want to ravenously create or ravenously put in the work, because then that's the passion. That's what it's for. And I mean, all this sounds actually absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to get my hands on the new stuff that you're creating, as well as the stuff that you've created already before. Is it fair enough to say, now you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you mentioned, I know you've done some stuff from superhero to, anime, Eastern inspired. And I also have actually had a chance to look at your Asian bestiary thing. Accidentally, ironically enough, your name had rung a bell when I saw you on Twitter, and then I looked back at it. It was a small RPG. It's called OVA. It's like an anime RPG.
Yep, I know that. Yeah.
Oh, you know it?
I know of it. I've never played it, and I honestly will admit I don't understand the rules.
It's a silly fucking system, dude. I'm not going to lie to you. I was looking at it, and I was like, there was eventually a point to where, like, somebody was rolling 12d6 against my 6d6, but because all they had was, like, junk rolls, and I got 3 6s, I beat them or something. Like, it's a really, really stupid system, but it's really fun in its silliness, and obviously, I only do it for, like, kind of one-shots where I want to get really animated up and do my shonen things. But when I was prepping those adventures, I told my regular D&D group, I'm like, hey guys, we're gonna have some just one shots to kind of clear our minds and clear our palates before we go into this big thing. I was like, oh shit, I gotta get like Asian inspired monsters together. And ironically enough, you had an Asian bestiary volume series. It was a hero system, but I saw a lot of the monsters in there and stuff, and I'm like, oh shit, this is a great resource. And here I am, over a year later. So that's kind of funny how I knew of you before I knew of you. But would you say like, what's your setting that appeals to you the most, or at least currently? Was it fantasy? Is it superheroes?
No, there's, okay. So, I created Kazei 5, which is your my homage to 80s cyberpunk anime. It's got Bubblegum Price's Hard Suits. It's got Appleseed Landmates. It's got cat-eared replicated humans, so you get your cat girls like the Puma sisters from Dominion. Mm-hmm. It's got espers, because I was a big fan of Akira, And, it's got that Blade Runner, everything.
Neon aesthetic. Yeah. Been to Japan. It's real. I love it.
Yeah. So my friend Ross Watson, and I keep bringing his name up mainly because he's my roommate, and he and I have worked a lot. And I'm also, I will admit, I'm getting him out. I want you to interview him too.
Absolutely.
But he spun that into something called Shadows Angelus, which is where he took all of that and he added magic, which is not Shadowrun, but Silent Mobius, which is probably my favorite manga anime that most people don't know about. And I wish it was getting more love in the States. It's on its 30th anniversary, and I would love Kodanisha to do the same thing for that they're doing for Battle Angel and Akira, where they bring it all back in a nice box set or something. Maybe, I don't know. And Kiyasamaya's doing a whole new manga, and I can't even read Japanese, but I'm like buying them from Japan because I'm just goggling over how his art is improved and how there's so many characters now that it's such a perfect RPG setting. And what he did was that he created a campaign that I will state is my best campaign ever. If Jeff felt that My Curse of Strahd was the best campaign he ever played in, the 24 sessions that we played of Shadows Angelus around 2005, 2006 is still probably the best game I was ever in. And we were members of XSWAT. We were paranormal police fighting Lovecraftian monsters in a floating city of the future in the year 2112, the Rush edition. And it was lightning in a bottle. It is a setting that Ross wants to go back to, and we have talked about what we want to do with it. The new superhero system that we're developing and producing for Evil Beagle, because of the way it plays, and I think it's fast anime style. It may actually we may be able to port Kazei 5 and Shadows Angelus over to that, but we definitely want to do something to bring it out and get it to the wider market, because I think it's something that people would really dig as a system, and it is the setting. It's not a system. It's the setting that I really, really enjoy. I have a convention game that I run using that setting, and people have been like, "What is this? I want to know more about it." And it's something that I for whatever reason I can actually develop in my head for that easier than I can for my own Kazei 5 setting, which is odd, but it's just how it happens. It's just something that really has grabbed hold. And if you go to my website, and if you ping me by email, I can actually send you the link. I have a link called "The Best Game I Ever Played," I believe, and you can read all about what went on and all the characters and such. And even now, I believe back in Maryland, they are the group that I used to play with is talking about doing another arc or camp or such set in it. So we've jokingly called it the game that will not die.
God damn it, I love that, and I love RPGs. This is why I do the podcast and why I talk to people and why I spend the money and go out to the conventions and do all the things, because of this kind of feeling, this emotion. It's evoking. We're sitting around a table talking make-believe and we're playing make-believe, but it feels so very strong and so very real and so very nostalgic. And, I still to this day, I just recently actually got tweeted an image from a player of mine who's moved away, but he found an old character sheet in one of my games that he used to play and goes, "Hey, look at this." And like this wave of emotions, like, "Oh shit, it's this Warforged that I used to play. Holy fuck." Like this is what I love about these fucking RPGs and things like that. And yeah, I'll definitely get that link and set that up for you. But, if you kind of easily segue for me, if people do want to contact you, Mike, what's the easiest way?
Well, the joke used to be, and I may still hold now, that if you put my last name into Google and hit "I feel lucky," you go to my website. But that website has not been maintained for a long time, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I would love to get a new website that I can now put my D&D conversions and my Prowlers and Paragons material onto, but I do not have the time, energy, or money to try to convert my old website, which has about 8,000 files, into a WordPress or anything. It's just a staggering amount of work that I don't know what to do with. However, there are plenty of, there's a couple of Surbrooks on Facebook, but there's only one Michael Surbrook. And I'm on Facebook. If you look for me on Twitter, I have stepped up my Twitter game where I'm trying to do multi-part essays. I actually want to talk about. I have a couple subjects I want to talk about coming up, including representation in RPGs, switching characters, and character death, and how it can expand, and any other suggestions. And sometimes I talk about silly stuff, like if you had the rights to any IP in the universe, what game would you make? My answer was Borderlands. So was Jeff's. But you can also email me if you really want to talk to me straight up, because if you go to my website or such, you can contact me that way. And actually, my Twitter feed, I believe, has my website, and so does my Facebook. And I'm always willing to talk about games and what's going on and my thoughts on things. And I tend to discourse on game-related stuff and such in Facebook. But my Twitter feed, if you're mostly interested in what my thoughts on gaming and such, that would be my Twitter feed. Also, if you look for Evil Beagle Games, I am a part owner and developer, and you can see what we are doing as a company. And I have my own little product line, Michael Surbrook Presents, which includes some Savage World, some Hero, a lot of D&D, and some completely system agnostic, such as Filthy Lucre, one of my favorite articles that I wrote, which is a long treatise on fantasy money and the realities of money in the real world, and how you may want to up your fantasy game by making your money more than just bland gold pieces, and giving it names and denominations and trading in things other than coin.
Oh, don't get me started on that. I have an economics degree, and for a small bit, I was running like a sub-story, a sub-arc in my 2 campaigns about like the monetary systems and how, some people were doing gold standard, and another kingdom was introducing fiat currency and all that stuff, which I'm super into because, again, I have an economics degree and I'm an idiot. And my players were like, this is what why is there different names and why is there different currency exchange rates? And I'm like, maybe this is too much. I'll just keep this to my Excel spreadsheets. I'm good. Don't worry about
me, guys. Note that if you're going to run a Matt Mercer really expansive game, you probably don't want to do what I talk about. But if you're going to set it in just one single city, if you're going to be Lankmar, or if you're going to be Lies of Loch Lemuria, or even Name of the Wind, you may just ditch the gold standard and go to silver and talk about, crowns and half crowns and shillings and pennies and marks and whatever. And certainly if you're going to do a game set in Japan, you have to learn that if you want that feudal Japan feel, you're going to have to talk about, you're going to have to learn the monetary system, because it's completely different. And I do talk about how to, things that you're talking about, exchange rates and loans, and the idea that you could be sponsored by an adventuring company who expect a percentage of the treasure you find when you come back to pay for the
whole character arc for one of my campaigns was somebody paying down their student debt from magic school. Like that's the type of shit. And maybe I'm weird, but fortunately my players are cool with it, where I like to also introduce real life struggles into their fantasy games.
Well, also for all you thieves and rogues, the article talks about how to defraud currency and how it really was done. And you're like, oh, here's ways that I as a rogue can mess around with coinage if the GM lets me. Here's how to counterfeit. Here's how to make money on the side by scraping silver out of a silver coin, or shaving the edge, or shaking it in the bag and taking the dust. And I want to do one on law too. I actually have a bunch of resources in my personal library on medieval law, and I want to do one, in which I actually open up with your traditional midnight players stagger out of the tavern into the street, and there's passersby and link boys and everything, and sort of to paraphrase Last Jedi, everything I've just written there is wrong if you look at it from a medieval standpoint. And sure, you can say, it's a fantasy game, it's not the European Middle Ages, but it's one of the best resources we have to try to provide some
verisimilitude.
Thank you. I'm like Mercer. I read the word. I haven't usually pronounced a lot of them, but how you can make things seem more real and more and provide new challenges. I mean, imagine if people rode into town and all of a sudden they're arrested and they found out you're not allowed to wear purple because purple is only for nobility. We have statuary laws. You're like, what? And there's a whole, and somebody goes, you're just messing with this. hey, but what are you going to do about it? You're a paladin. You uphold the law of the land, and this says this is what you're supposed to do. What are you going to do? They've arrested your rogue. You got to bust them out of prison. What are you going to do? And you can actually, especially for city-centric adventures, you can provide a lot of new ideas and fuel and plot hooks and seeds. And I think we've really run over your 1 hour time.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, like, we had you doing your like, here's my stuff, and I'm about to do the final call out, and then we got into another tangent. Damn it, this is why
you want to do a 2 hour show? No, we can't do a 2 hour show.
We can. We would. I would gladly do one. I'll have you back on because you actually mentioned representation, which is a thing I touched a little bit on in my Jeff thing, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper, considering that's something that's important to my games as well. So there's some other topics that I think, Mike, you're going to be great to have back on.
Certainly.
But for those of you who are listening and want to contact me, the podcast email is myrpgpodcast@gmail.com. You can, of course, find us on Podbean and on iTunes. It's just MyRPG Podcast. My personal Twitter is @classy_Don if you just want to talk to me about any of that stuff at all. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the table.